The term leftover women, or 剩女, was actually defined by the All China Women's Federation in 2007 to mean an urban educated woman over the age of 27 who's still single. Since then, it's become very widely used all over China. It's extremely derogatory. And I thought about using, whether I should use a derogatory term as the title of the book, but the fact is, I look at this phenomenon of gender inequality in China, and I argue that women are not just so-called leftover if they're urban and single in their 20s, but that women as a whole have been left over and left behind by the Chinese government since the onset of market reforms. And there's been a lot of research that's been conducted since the onset of market reforms. It relates to the dismantling of the planned economy. If you look at the early era, of the communist era, women were really held up. Chairman Mao famously said that women hold up half the sky, and women were publicly celebrated. The Communist Party introduced all these initiatives like assigning urban women jobs, assigning women to managerial positions. But since the onset of market reforms at the beginning of the 1980s, a lot of that has really unraveled. The dismantling and restructuring of the state-owned enterprises, which began in the 1990s, involved layoffs of many, many workers. So women were the first to be fired, women were the last to be rehired. And then as there were no longer these quotas for appointing women to positions in the work unit, then a lot of the traditional gender discriminatory norms began to resurface in hiring practices, in promotion practices. So there's a lot of evidence showing that there's a dramatically increasing gender income gap. There's a declining female labor force participation, particularly in the cities. And then you have new media campaigns, one of which I focus on, which the Leftover Women campaign, which is really insulting these urban educated single women in their 20s, trying to push them into getting married and stop focusing on their careers. I think that this campaign is essentially another form of a women return to the home movement that has recurred over the past few decades. And it's really very short-sighted on the part of China's leaders, because it's going to be very damaging for China's long-term economic growth, because essentially the state is telling the country's most talented and educated women that they shouldn't be working so hard, they shouldn't be pursuing their educations, they should instead be focusing on finding a good husband and having a child. And if you look at other countries like Japan and South Korea, they now recognize that there's a huge problem for the economy when the workforce is losing talented, educated women. But the Chinese government has not said anything about that. They clearly are more concerned about maintaining social stability and also about so-called upgrading population quality. Basically, this notion of upgrading quality is a form of eugenics, and eugenics have long been a part of China's population planning. It's been widely used, and it's widely considered to be completely acceptable to think that some people are of higher quality than others. What I found to be very disturbing is that a lot of these educated women actually believe that they will have trouble finding a husband after their mid-20s. And so when they get married, they often make these huge economic compromises. And I focus on the purchase of residential property in particular, because home buying is inextricably linked with marriage in China today. So I found a lot of educated young women would transfer their life savings over to their boyfriend to finance the purchase of a very expensive marital home, but then they would leave their name off the property deed, and they would forfeit ownership of this incredibly valuable marital home. But I also conducted a lot of interviews with feminist activists who are fighting back against gender discrimination, and I also interviewed women who who don't consider themselves to be politically very progressive or activist, but they're making an individual choice to not marry. And that sounds a little bit radical, but that actually gave me a lot of hope, because these women recognize that they have the power to choose their own life path. And they have concluded that marriage is a bad institution for women, and so they're not planning to marry. They want to stay single, and maybe they'll buy their own home. Interviews with these women really gave me hope. So it wasn't altogether depressing, and sometimes it was extremely inspiring.